Okay, today we're going to be installing an OEM oil cooler on the 86. So this is a Subaru OEM oil cooler that's found on the turbocharged versions of the FA20 engine in the WRX, Levorg and XT Forester. So, and it's also, if you see, have a look at photos of the brand new 2022 GT86 and BRZ, you can see that this is the same oil cooler that's featured on that engine. So why would you want to run an oil cooler? So I'm running 0W20 as recommended by Subaru and Toyota for this vehicle. So as oil gets really hot, you lose oil pressure, so I want to keep those temperatures down to a reasonable level, especially on really hot days. So when it gets into the sort of high 30s and low 40s in terms of temperature, it's degrees Celsius, I want to be running an oil cooler for a bit of extra protection for this engine when running that lighter weight oil. Okay, so what do you need in terms of supplies and tools? So we've got the oil cooler here. So it's a sandwich plate style oil cooler. That's the part number that I'm using here. So I'll put that in the description, or it'll appear on screen as well. You'll also need an oil cooler connector. So that is significantly larger than the standard one that's in the car at the moment. So that is where your oil filter spins on to the filter housing. So I'll show you that when we get to that. Other bits pieces we're going to need, heater hose. So this is 3/8 or 9.5 millimeters. Make sure you buy a decent heater hose. So this is Gates heater hose. So don't buy the cheap crap off eBay. Know where you're getting it from, so buy it from an auto parts store, so you're making sure that you get good quality hose, because you're going to be relying on this as part of your cooling system, so you don't want any splits or poor quality hose that's going to potentially lead to a coolant leak and engine failure. Similarly, make sure you buy decent hose clamps as well. So I've got Trident part stainless steel, so they're 8 to 22 millimeters, and that's the part number there. I've also got an oil filter. May or may not need that. I've recently changed the oil and filter on this vehicle, so I might be able to get away with using the filter that's on it now. So I'll just make sure that the mating surface and the gasket on that filter is okay, and we can reuse that. We may need a bit of oil, so I've got some 0W20 there. So you'll also need some coolant. So I've got some Subaru Long Life blue coolant here. It's pre-mixed, ready to go. You can also use some aftermarket coolant, so long as it's the blue stuff. There's plenty of that available on the market, and it's a lot cheaper than the Subaru genuine long life stuff. So it meets OEM specifications, so that'll be no problem at all to use that. So in terms of tools, we'll just use a filter removal tool, cup type. We'll need a torque wrench, a breaker bar, a 1/2-inch drive and extension, 24 millimeter deep socket. So we'll need to use that to get that oil filter union bolt out of the engine. Also need a couple of screwdrivers, a flat and a Phillips head. I've just got a freezer bag and some tape, so I'm just going to use the freezer bag to cover over the throttle body when we've got that open, so nothing crawls, flies or falls into that while that intake tube is off. A bit of rag and some gloves, and also grab yourself a cup of boiling water as well. You'll notice with this cooler here, one of these pipes is a bit larger than the other, so that's about 10 mil, and that's a bit larger, so we'll need the hot water to heat up the end of the heater hose, so we can slide that on to that pipe with no problem at all. As I said before, they're using this style of cooler on the new version of the 86 with the larger motor, so it's easy to fit, so that's a big advantage of going for this style of cooler over your traditional, I guess, sort of air to oil coolers. So there's no running oil lines, you don't have to remove the front clip of the car to position an oil cooler. You don't need any extra oil in the engine, because I'm gathering that any oil that goes up into this cooler will drain out and back into the sump once the vehicle's stopped. And you're not going to have any old oil sitting in a traditional oil cooler where you're running lines to the front of the car and using you know, that, I guess, a radiator style oil cooler. So when you drain your sump with those types of setups, you're not going to get all the oil out of the vehicle. You're going to have a fair bit of oil left in the oil lines to the cooler and in the cooler itself. These style of coolers, because they're circulating engine coolant in, they will heat up the oil faster, so it'll take less time to get the engine oil up to operating temperature, so that's an advantage as well. Now, in terms of price, what are you going to pay for one of these? So in Australia, that cooler is $608, and the oil cooler connector bolt, that is $113. So yeah, I nearly fell off my chair when I was quoted the prices from those from the Subaru dealer. So that's just ridiculous. So what I did was I jumped online and got this set up from Parts SOQ or SUQ. I'll check the name of that and post that in the description. So they're in the United Arab Emirates, and for the cooler and the connection bolt, that cost me $245 delivered. So that's about a third of the price that you're paying for that from Subaru in Australia. And in terms of delivery time, they had, Subaru Australia had that in stock ex-Sydney, but this connection for the oil filter, that was an 8 to 10 week wait, so that's crazy. I ordered this stuff from you know, Parts SOQ, and I had it delivered in under a week into Australia from the United Arab Emirates, so that's outstanding, really. Heater hose, it's I think $10 or $12 a meter, and I can't remember what the hose clamps were, but they weren't all that expensive. So in terms of price, this is a pretty effective way of adding an oil cooler to your BRZ or your FRS 86, whatever you want to call it. I guess the aftermarket radiator style oil coolers, you know, they're up around the, you know, sort of $800 or $900 or more in Australia, so they're pretty expensive options. And as I said before, they're a lot more difficult, or a lot more fiddling around to fit. So I don't track this car and don't have any intentions of tracking it. So in terms of oil cooling for it, this style of cooler will be ideal for it for street use. So I give it a bit of a flogging going through mountains and all that sort of stuff. So this type of cooler will be ideal for that. So they use that type of cooler or this OEM style of cooler on the turbocharged versions of the FA20 engine. So obviously Subaru have tested it. They wouldn't put it on their if it wasn't effective. So in terms of cooling for a normally aspirated engine, it should do the job on the street quite well. So we'll get into installing it. Okay, the first thing we need to do is just remove the intake tubing. So there's 3 clamps here, one there, one on the sound tube, and then one on the throttle body. So loosen that one and that one off with a flat screwdriver, and then get into that one with a Phillips head. You'll also need a pair of pliers, and we're just going to remove that vent pipe off the intake tube there as well. So I'm just going to put a freezer bag just over that intake throttle body, just so nothing goes in there when we're working on it, because that'll be shit. Okay, so you can see this pipe here. That is a cooler or a heater probably for the throttle body. So that runs hot coolant through the throttle body, possibly for emissions purposes. We're going to be using that pipe there. We're going to disconnect that and then run our coolant lines to our oil cooler via those fittings on the intake manifold. So next we'll get the oil filter off. We'll just clean up the oil that's on that filter housing there. Okay, so using our 24mm socket, we can remove that old oil filter union, and we may well need the breaker bar for this. Yep, you do. Okay, so that should just unscrew there quite easily. Now we can just put that aside. Okay, so I've got that hose fitted to the cooler there. So that's the larger outlet or inlet on that cooler, and it took a bit of effort to get that 3/8 hose onto there, so I soaked it in boiling water for about a minute, and also lubricated the end of that fitting with a bit of detergent, and that slid on pretty well with a bit of effort actually. So that's on there now, so we can go and route the coolant hose or heater hose back up underneath the air conditioning compressor, and then back up through underneath the throttle body there. Okay, so that's routed there now. You can see we've got a fair bit of hose left over, so we're going to have more than enough hose here with 2 meters of it. You should be able to see there where that hose is going straight underneath that air conditioning compressor and then back out the other side. The cooler has got a, you can just see at the bottom of there, only just though, there's a tab that actually slots into that hole just there, so that just helps locate the cooler on the correct orientation. So when that's in there, it then clears, so that's positioned there, then clears that of what I'm guessing is a fuel line going through there. Okay, so we can now put that locating bolt in, and we'll just leave that loose until we get everything, all those pipes run, and then we can tighten that up to the factory spec. Okay, so before we just put this cooler on, just grab a bit of oil and on the top of the filter housing there, and we just want to lubricate that gasket that is on the bottom of the oil cooler, and we can locate that in there properly, and then screw in the oil filter union bolt. So with the union bolt, we're screwing that in by hand all the way as far as we can before we put a tool on that, because we do not want to cross thread this. We'll just go hand tight, and then we'll tighten that up or torque that up to factory spec once we're done. Okay, so that's in place now. So we can cut off our first hose to length and then join that into the cooling that's running to the throttle body. Okay, so that first hose there is now cut to length, and I can go ahead and remove that existing heater hose for the throttle body there, and we can plumb in the cooling into, or the first part of the cooling into our oil cooler. So we'll remove those 2 clamps. Okay, so both of those clamps are off. A tip, grab yourself a really long set of pointy nose pliers to get that bottom one off. It was a pain in the ass. Righto, so we can remove that pipe now. So I'll just pull that top one off. And you can see a bit of coolant's come out of there. Just grab a rag, chuck that underneath that. Should have done that in the first place. So we're definitely going to get a fair bit of coolant come out of that bottom hose. In order to get that bottom hose clamp on in there, I don't know how well you can see that, but you can just see it down the bottom there. I've just had to remove this air line off the throttle body, so it's just getting in the way of the screwdriver. So I've just pulled that off, that one off there, and we'll get that hose clamp tight. Then that's that bottom outlet on that throttle body hooked up to coolant. Okay, so that bottom pipe's on now, and we've got the hose clamp done up tight, so we can run our second coolant line now. So we'll just thread that underneath the air conditioning compressor once again. Okay, to get that second hose in, just helps to have the cooler loose, so you can maneuver that first pipe around a bit, so you can get that second pipe through. So once that second pipe's through underneath the air conditioning compressor, then we can tighten, well, put the union bolt back in there, we won't tighten that just up yet, so we'll get that hose routed back around to where it should be, and then get the clamps on and then tighten everything back up. Okay, so you can see that where that pipe's been routed down there. I've just gone between those two sensors, so I've had to take the plug off that top black one there and just route it in between those two, and then come back up around the top there. So that's that hose done on that end. So now I just need to get it attached to the coolant port or outlet, inlet, whichever. It doesn't really matter which way they go. I haven't seen any guidance online about which way they're supposed to go or which way the coolant flows, and from all reports it doesn't matter either way. So we'll just get that top hose trimmed up and pushed onto that fitting and tighten up that hose clamp, and then we can put the intake tubing back on, and then we can get that oil union bolt torqued down to factory spec. So we'll get that done. So the intake's on, and the final step is just to tighten up this oil filter union bolt, and the torque setting as per the factory manual is 33 foot-pounds. So we're going to go to 33 foot-pounds and we should be right. So as I said before, you tighten this up by hand as far as you can and then finish it off with a torque wrench. Right, that's done. So we can reinstall our oil filter. And we are done. Okay, so that's what it looks like there now. So yeah, intake back on, all back together. Now what we need to do is check our coolant level, because we'll need to top that up, because we had a small amount of coolant come out of those ports on the throttle body. So we need to top that up, and then we'll go through the process of bleeding the air out of the cooling system, because we've introduced air into it. And back over this side, I'll just grab my torch. So just at the top of that little jigger there that you can see in the middle of the screen, that's the bleed valve. So we'll get in and release that, and then we'll start bleeding the cooling system in accordance with the factory specifications. So we'll just take the radiator cap off and see if we've got any coolant visible there, and you can see that it's there that the coolant level has dropped. So first thing we need to do is top that off. Shouldn't take too much, I wouldn't imagine. Oh, bugger all really. Okay, so we've got coolant there. The next thing we need to do is just release our bleeder valve. So we'll just undo that bleeder valve with a Phillips head screwdriver. Get it started there. Rest of the way by hand, making sure we don't drop it, because who knows where it's going to go. Okay, so we've got coolant there, so we can seal that back up. And then we can put our radiator cap back on. And then the next part of the operation is to start the car and race the engine up to about 3000 RPM 5 or 6 times within about 40 seconds. And then we're going to shut the car off, leave it for a minute, and then check if we've got any air at that bleeder that we need to release, and then we can top up with coolant again. Okay, starting the car. Let's go up to 3,000.
Black view for your safe driving. Starting normal recording.
And that'll do, we'll shut that off. And we'll leave it.
Powering down.
We'll leave that for a minute. And just check if we've got air where that bleeder is. Okay, so I'll take that off. Okay, so it's good. We've got coolant there. Let's pop that back on. Okay, now we'll move on to the next part. Okay, so we've run the car once and we've had to top up the radiator again. So now I've got full radiator and I can see coolant at that bleed valve. Okay, so the next part of the operation, we're going to start the car again. We're going to have the heater on, the fan speed set to low with the air conditioning off. So that's heater on, fan speed low and air conditioning off, and then we're going to allow the car to idle up to temperature, and then we're going to shut it off and then allow it to cool, and then we're going to be checking the levels of our radiator and our bleed valve once the car is cold. Okay, and if we see any coolant in the bleed valve, we're all good. We don't have to do anything else. So once that's done, yeah, good to go. Check for any oil leaks and water leaks at your oil cooler and underneath the throttle body while your car's warming up. You shouldn't have any, but if you do, you're going to have to pull things apart and fix it. Okay, and that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching.